Kongres Współpracy Transgranicznej Lublin 2022. Bezpieczeństwo i solidarność. Coroczne spotkanie praktyków współpracy transgranicznej z Unii Europejskiej i Partnerstwa Wschodniego. 3 dni paneli, spotkań i debat liderów samorządowych, organizacji pozarządowych i ekspertów z całej Europy. Forum partnerów. Giełda grantodawców. Wizyty studyjne, warsztaty, koncerty i spektakle. Na żywo i online. Lublin, 5-7 października 2022. Zarejestruj się bezpłatnie na stronie kongres.lublin.eu.
Witamy Państwa na kolejnym panelu o bardzo intrygująco brzmiącym tytule Dezinformacja i manipulacja, wpływ na bezpieczeństwo i współpracę regionalną. Patrząc na skład panelistów...
Well, welcome to our next panel after lunch. Looking at the guests we have here, at the speakers, we can say an intellectual feast is ahead of us. The chair of this panel...
Jest do środkowej, tak.
The chair of this panel, thank you for correcting me. The chair of this panel, Jakub Olchowski, Institute of Central Europe in Lublin. He will introduce the speakers. Indeed, I'm not going to introduce myself at this moment. It has already happened. We originally planned to have 3 speakers. Unfortunately, Dr. Bildziukiewicz from East StratCom Task Force from Brussels. She has not been able to join us, even online. But still we are here, and perhaps we will have more time, more room for questions and for exchange during and after this panel. So we have here absolutely the first league of experts in fake news and disinformation, Professor Legucka, Polish Institute of International Affairs. She also teaches at Vistula University of Economics in Warsaw. Welcome. She has published a number of publications on Russia, on Russia's foreign policy, and on disinformation and propaganda. And our second speaker, Dr. Mahda, straight from Kyiv, Director of the Institute of Global Politics and a teacher at Kyiv Technical University, author of a number of books on hybrid war waged by Russia, on disinformation as a weapon wielded by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, and not only. We don't have much time, an hour, so we are scheduled to close at 4, and the subject is really interesting and broad as the Dnieper River, so I'm not sure if we are able to exhaust it. I think it's interesting enough for some people not to even realize how relevant it is. So let's talk about why disinformation and propaganda are so relevant.
Że tego rodzaju instrumenty są używane w konfliktach czy ogólnie.
Such instruments indeed are used in conflicts, in social conflicts. This is nothing new. It has always been the case. But now things look a bit different because Russia is a real expert in using these tools. So my question to you, Professor, nothing new on the other hand, but why is this topic so relevant today? Why Russia is so good at using these tools? Well, first, thank you very much for having me on this panel. I like Lublin very much. I like coming here. It's not the first Congress here that I attend. I study Russia, of course, as a scientist. And not so long ago,
Kupieckim
me and Robert Kupiecki published
rosyjskiej narracji
an article on the Russian narrative and disinformation.
O, jak miło. Ja zapomniałam.
Oh, how cool. We have this book here.
Zapomniałam,
Yes.
Przerwę.
Let me cut in for a moment. We do have this book in here,
W języku angielskim.
relatively new one, relatively fresh one,
Dana właśnie przez panią profesor.
co-edited by Professor Legucka. So I'm talking about this publication
takiego polskiego
because
punktu widzenia.
for some time we missed a Polish voice and a Polish viewpoint, and also Ukrainian one,
Publicystyce i nauce
on
w świecie akademickim.
on disinformation in the global academic circles. So it's a voice about how we approach and understand Russian propaganda and disinformation. You know that editing and publication is not a short process, but luckily we were able to
Lecz do tego,
enlist the cooperation of Radlist Publishing House,
że propaganda działa.
and we have been able to publish it.
Jak konflikt rozgorzał na nowo, czyli rosyjską interwencję
Well, this book actually came out before
się
the conflict in Ukraine.
w tym roku. I dlaczego Rosja tak skutecznie
So why Russia is so effective
z informacji
in disinformation and propaganda?
lat
And it has been so for many, many years.
wojny w Ukrainie od
And
2014 roku i bym powiedziała,
they actually started back in 2014, of course, and this is when the European Union also realized this problem.
zauważała go dopiero
But in fact,
rosyjska
it
informacja do
the EU really realized the power of Russian disinformation when it was affected by it, when Russia interfered with some internal processes in European countries and in the United States, just to mention American
to
pre-elections in 2016. That was the moment when the problem became really visible, really tangible, and started to be explored, also research-wise.
ten mag
And Yevhen
jest autorem,
Yevhen is an author of many
państwem
papers on this. Ukraine
Rosja działała
has been experiencing the effects of these
ten problem
of this Russian
dopiero
strategy for so long, but in the United States they realized the power of it only when they experienced it themselves. And speaking of the EU, and it's a pity
ten polski
Dr. Bildziukiewicz isn't here with us.
pani Martyna, jak
Along with the EU, the Polish viewpoint also gained in importance, and in particular since Martyna
2015
took the office at StratCom task force. But I can say it was a process
postanowiła
from the first attempt to identify and confirm that Russia was a threat, and Russian disinformation was a threat at least threefold. It was regular, systematic, it was long-term and well organized. So well funded by the Kremlin.
zidentyfikowane to, w jaki sposób
We were even able to identify how
służby specjalne,
this disinformation worked through secret services, the mass media, and
jakby nie
many different structures.
ona skutecznie działała na naszym obszarze,
And how effective it was in our part of the world,
polegał na,
well,
działała jakby w przebraniu.
the trick was that it was kind of working in disguise. it was Russian disinformation and propaganda was clothed as democratic and a free actor and voice
czyli na
on the global scene. So the Russian media, such as RT and Sputnik,
przestrzeni medialnej
they operated within the European media space
przewodnim
in many languages.
czyli
Their catchphrase was question more,
może być bardziej
doubt more. So we can't imagine anything more European and more democratic than asking questions, than being critical, than doubting what's around us.
bardzo kryzysowy.
And
No i żyjemy
we used to live, we still are living in a world
bardzo spolaryzowanymi,
which is very polarized,
wątpiącymi w tym, co dzieje się z
very doubting about what we see,
skuteczność i efektywność
and
dezinformacji.
the effectiveness of Russia's disinformation among us in Europe.
Na razie.
Let's ignore the USA for a moment. But speaking of the EU,
Umiejętność działania na naszym
they are very skillful in moving around our place. Russia also tried to pretend to be anti-systemic, someone who doesn't want to change anything in us, in our societies. They only want to join a debate, to be just one of the voices, one of the mediums, one of the media that asks questions.
testy żółtych kamizelek.
For example, during the Yellow Vest protests in France,
Którzy bardzo często
Russian media very often invited the protesters
uwagę
for conversations, for debates, and this is how they gained trust of the protesters and the French audience. So they were no longer considered a Russian medium because they gave some space for exchange. They turned anti-systemic, anti-USA,
pamiętamy,
anti-anything else. Later on, the pandemic started, so they started to be anti-LGBT, anti-vaccination. So anything that comes to your mind, they were against it. So in the Polish
że rosyjscy
space, Russian disinformation doesn't work in Poland. And indeed, many Poles
skutecznie
believe
impregnowani
that we are kind of immune to Russian disinformation, but we are not immune to anti-movements.
jeżeli chodzi o Twitter i media
Some studies on Twitter and social media show that many people who were anti-vaccination when
ukraińskie narracji.
the Ukrainian influx into Poland started, all those people on the social media started to be anti-migrant or anti-refugee. So, since we are immune to Russian disinformation, we are not immune to anti-Ukrainian narrative, anti-US narrative, or anti-European narrative.
Działają.
And this is how Russia is working on us right now. The Russian services, they adjust their messages, their narrative to specific communities, nations and conditions. They are very clever in adapting.
Przestrzeni, do której działają.
They can always adjust their strategy to the area of operation.
Dlatego są niebezpieczne.
That's why they're dangerous, because they have placed themselves as anti-systemic.
Często zdarza mi się,
And it happens,
nie,
I happen to come across ideas that we as democratic societies, we don't allow RT or Sputnik to operate freely. They are mass media, so we should allow them to be here.
nie.
Well, I think no. They are not mass media. They are a weapon in the information war of the Russian Federation. This is just a weapon, just like a cannon shelling an area. Okay, I think I should stop at this point because I could, of course, go on, but I'd be happy to pass the mic over to you.
Thank you, Professor, for the brilliant introduction here. Let me just recall a phrase. The cunniest trick of the devil was, conviction spread among the public that it doesn't exist. So this is something that the Russians did, and this is something that on top of the anti-systemic character, which is the basic disguise of the Russian propaganda. So on top of this, there's this the conservative entourage that they used. I mean, they actually succeeded in convincing the large part of the Western public that they are defenders of the conservative value, especially in the clash with the rotten morality of the West, against which President Putin is defending the civilization. But let me ask.
Jak to jest, że
Yevhen, Mahda, what about the West? If the Russians, have been successful in using all these instruments, they've got the know-how, they've got the experience. How come the West is unable or incapable of pursuing such initiatives? This is one of the books by Yevhen. Win and Survive. I've got his autograph here. So, what about the West? First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for having displayed this book. It's it was published originally 7 years ago, so it's quite old. It would be really good that this book or any book is simply read by people. People should read books instead of watching TV. So why the cause that I would give in answering your question is that we are unable to use information. Information is a commodity, and information is a weapon. This is how Russia uses it. I can tell you that with the audience here, experienced people, knowledgeable people, and so on. There are not a single person who wouldn't have fallen victim to disinformation. I have myself. This tells us that fake news, disinformation is generated by a state-run machinery. Why is Russia doing this? Why has it been doing this for so long? Ukraine, for over 7 months now, has been faced with quite different challenges, military challenges, the quest for survival, for perseverance. But all our neighbors, face actually different challenges in contemporary world. Not everyone, is given the opportunity to witness something in person. So people use information sourced from anywhere else. And the Russian Today and Sputnik media, as Professor mentioned, in the EU now are the past. The problem is that Russian fake news and disinformation are broadcast by Russian state outposts like Interfax. So they are on a par with other media outposts globally. They simply broadcast fake news and simply lies. Let me give you an example. Bucha massacre. For millions of Europeans, the word means actually a war crime committed by Russians in Ukraine, and Russia claims just the reverse. I mean, it didn't happen. It's just it's been made up. It's not true. So this is very like the Nazis' policy, information policies. Nazis organized
депортованих туди євреїв.
Concentration camps, where they show to the public, happy lives of deported Jews. While at the same time, the Treblinka, death camp, they killed, thousands of people every day. So Russia, as any totalitarian state, knows very well how democracies work. But it doesn't use, actually, the knowledge to build democracy in Russia itself. It uses the knowledge, the know-how, to influence, to meddle, to interfere via the agencies, via the partners that can be
Якщо я назву
can operate under different
буде своя
forms, personalities, and so on. If I tell you one name, Angela Merkel, we all have got opinions about the woman as a politician that set directions for German policies over years. But if I tell you a combination of names, that is Angela Merkel and Nord Stream 2, well, the connotations, the associations will be quite different. So, Russian misinformation is counterfactual the information that can be sold, and the earnings can be used for political corruption, for pushing Russia's own the interest and building the influence in Western societies. I mean, we simply are unwilling to admit that we may have fallen a victim of disinformation, but it's, mind you, it's natural. I mean, nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to be embarrassed about. What we need is to work out a joint system to counter, to fight the disinformation attempts from Russia. There's, the Russian peace, the Ruski Mir, is packed like a matryoshka, inside which there's the armed soldier, just waiting to assault you. So I think that we'll all agree that as long as Ukraine continues its fight against Russia, Europe will be exposed to the spread of disinformation, misinformation and fake news, and not armed struggle.
Czy Rosja prowadzi wojnę hybrydową?
So the hybrid war is something that I would call the phenomena that you have mentioned. This is an asymmetrical phenomenon. Russia just takes advantage of the weaknesses of the opponent, the West. That is, the freedom of speech. There's no free speech in Russia, so the Kremlin doesn't have to take care of what people think or say. Whereas, the Russian channels can tell us anything in the West, using our communication tools. So this is the asymmetry, to the detriment of the West. Is this fight, capable of being fought at all for us? Can we win this fight?
Zagrożeniom się jakoś przeciwstawić.
Can we just, oppose it somehow? Yes, we can.
Badanie.
And this is clear from research.
to, co powiedzieliśmy,
I think that what we have said before, that
agresja
the Russian aggression,
zmieniła.
has changed a lot in perceptions, and
Zmieniła.
especially today. The pandemic has taught us a lesson. That's true, and the Russian aggression
I też
has also kind of reinforced this lesson. I mean, self-awareness of Russian disinformation, Chinese disinformation, and the threats that they entail. I'm not a super optimist now to say that Russian disinformation will disappear and will cease to be a threat.
To jest chyba
Let me just say one thing. What's
to, że Rosjanie
more burning problem today, as I see it, is that the Russians try to export something that they have succeeded in, domestically. That is, they want to take advantage of, kind of the moment when the truth is completely, reversed. To give you an example, when something happens, like the Bucha massacre or Navalny's poisoning, they never keep silent about that. They always would, spread thousands of interpretations of interpretations of the event to arouse some uncertainty in the audiences about what actually happened, and whether Bucha or Navalny's poisoning or any other event, we start to feel that we will never learn the truth. And this is the biggest threat. And as said before, the recipient, the audience, is to be convinced that everyone lies. This is the message that the Russians give to the world, to our region, to our communities. And in today's world, when there's a post-truth era, the depreciation of authorities, depreciation of reliable information, no hope for that. The Russian policies, Russian disinformation, actually take these as the target. I wouldn't only mention TASS. I would say that it's the entire state structure, diplomacy. Mind you, Sergei Lavrov, it's not a man of diplomacy now. It's a reflection of the machinery of the state. Washing Russia disinformation, in my opinion, in the Anglosphere, is actually a bigger threat to us. What I mean is that anything happens. There are Russian professionals getting employed in prestigious, renowned media outposts like the Times, New York Times, and so on. So we may be impregnated, against Russian misinformation, because we know that RIA Novosti is a lying outpost, simply. But if we read something in New York Times, it's more credible. Or if you read a tweet from Elon Musk, a view on his view on possible referendums in Luhansk or Donbass. This becomes, a topic in the public international debate. And such arguments, such points are actually fit well in the Russian propaganda, although they are not directly linked to the Russian sources. So, to answer your question, if the West have appropriate instruments to counter that, let me say this. I think we should learn a lot from Ukrainians. Ukrainians have coped very well so far with Russian disinformation. They have done a great job fighting this misinformation, disinformation. And, in the Western, compared to the Western European information bubble, Ukrainians have actually, have been the most successful in countering that. Except for some singular groups, there are no conditions in Western Europe to kind of actively spread Russian propaganda. But still, the information bubble is there. There is Africa, Latin America, China, Hungary as an exception in Europe. All these geographies, tend to kind of spread and disseminate Russian misinformation. Let me give you an example of Latin America. We had a meeting with the Latin American experts from Brazil, where they witnessed perhaps not, outright the support to the Russian narrative, but there's a clash with the anti-US attitudes. So I learned that in some military communities there, the attitude is that, or the opinion is that the US could attempt to actually to grab the Amazon the region without any referendum. So the Russians actually take advantage of all these elements. And as Poles, we may be pro-Ukrainian, but we must be aware that there's a long way for us to go to burst these bubbles, both in Europe and in other global regions. At the UN forum, the Russians still succeed in playing the cards in the information the bubble. With Sputnik and Russian Today, are present there. Anti-US, anti-European sentiments actually have the strongest potential for the Russians to build disinformation policies on. But there is still hope for us to counter, to fight Russian disinformation. Thank you very much. Just to add one thing to what you said, Agnieszka, you mentioned all the activities, the efforts to convince everyone that everyone is lying, that there's no truth. That's the point. The Russian propaganda and those who spread this disinformation don't have the motto from Russia with the love, or Putin is the best leader in the world. No, what they tend to say is that, well, you should be critical. Switch off the television. The television lies. Ask questions, and this is what this is the modus operandi. When the pandemic started, there were a lot of the groups, active on the social media, anti-vaxxers, bloggers, and so on. And their point was never about convincing anyone that vaccines are bad or that people shouldn't get vaxxed. The point is about
społeczeństwo.
polarization, about
I nagle, kiedy zaczęła się w
meddling in social peace and so on.
jakimś dziwnym
Because just after the outbreak of the world, those anti-vaxxers group turns out to be anti-Ukrainian,
myślenia
and I think that this was
eksperci
a clue to a lot of people in Poland.
analitycy.
There were, analysts, journalists, have been quite open for years that this is the
Jakimś
disinformation efforts supported by Russia. But the general public didn't recognize that. And now when we see clearly
przypadek.
our own eyes that, anti-vaxxers turned, by some miracle, anti-Ukrainian, it's not a coincidence.
O tym,
But a question to you, Doctor.
no właśnie, czego
As Agnieszka mentioned,
Zachód może
what can the West learn from Ukrainians? Ukrainians seem to be quite resistant to the Russian propaganda and disinformation efforts. Why?
Я тут хочу навести цікавий приклад про антивакцинаторів. Один український антивакцинатор
Speaking about anti-vaccination movement, there was one guy in Ukraine doing this. He's now very high in the military administration in Russia.
колаборантів.
So
Лише
he
свідчить,
was one of the 10 biggest collaborators, Ukrainian collaborators with Russia. It shows
би мовити,
how
журналістські ми беремо з кількох джерел.
a transformation of such people may look like.
Найбільш
Ukraine, at this point, is really the most glaring example.
дезінформації.
Can we fight Russian disinformation at this point?
На перший погляд.
I don't know if this is easy. It's not easy, certainly.
В мовах
As you look at it, Ukraine now is fighting two types of propaganda, Russian and Ukrainian. The Russian propaganda
багато
resembles what we saw in the Soviet Union.
різні способи,
The propaganda
ті самі телеграм-канали,
employing
певні
many different ways and channels to communicate, like the Telegram,
є низка
which is also available from Poland. In Ukraine, we have many pro-Russian channels.
але вони
It's maybe not fair to judge the content as disinformation right away, but after 24th of February, many experts pointed to them, and
мислення
if you look at how many followers they have,
мирний час.
this means something. Critical thinking develops well in peaceful times, not at war.
Української
If I see certain pattern
мовах він
of Ukrainian propaganda in wartime,
це
I cannot, in a way,
непрофесійним, а
uncover it.
проти
I can't see through it.
хоче Україну знищити. Ця мета
Well, if I were able to do it, it would be unprofessional. But we oppose a state that wants to destroy Ukraine. So Ukraine now is, in a way, a medium of experience. It transfers experience. As a big state,
для того, щоб
we have also many big problems
з Вишеград
because we want our neighbors in the first place from the Visegrad group,
вони
Romania, the Baltics,
дивились
Bulgaria, to follow our example and draw their own conclusions. Because the challenges of today, they have not disappeared.
наратив руского
So if there is
свої
the narrative of Russian mir,
в гастролях російського балету,
it manifests itself in many places through Russian ballet, through Russian culture center in Paris.
хороші русські, які сотнями тисяч вирішили.
You know, we hear about good Russians who are now fleeing Putin
Зневажали і казали,
because of conscription, but they are not fleeing Putin to fight him.
і
They just don't want to go to war.
достатньо добре знає,
And Russia knows these tools very well. They never play according to the rules,
є
because if you play according to the rules,
до поразки.
then
Бо
if you are Russia, you will fail.
військовим потенціалом
Because Russia, with its military
ставити НАТО,
might,
економічним потенціалом, вона ні
they cannot counter NATO. Economically, they cannot counter the European Union.
які активно впливають в Європі. І відповідно
So, of course, there are forces that influence Europe.
про те, як цьому
So, since we are in Europe, we should tell people
противає на
how to oppose it, how to fight it.
ще Російської
If Russia
Радянського Союзу
speaks about its imperial ambitions,
імперією, а незалежною державою, яка є,
then we say we'd rather be an independent state, not part of an empire,
нам не завжди,
because it promises certain prospects.
як би це не дивно,
You don't need to be anti-Russian all the time,
держава, яка проти Росії воює. Але нам треба створювати Росії
you
альтернативу.
don't want to be a state that always fights Russia. In other words, we should create an alternative to Russia, because competition these days
Навпаки,
is a real power that shapes the world. And
і
unlike Russia, we want to play by the rules. And we want to follow the rules to move ahead.
Oby tak było. Tak jak na początku wspomniałem,
Yeah, as I said earlier, we don't have much time, and in fact, it's the last 15 minutes. So, one short question for everyone, and perhaps we can accept some questions from the room.
zatem pytanie do
So, a question to Agnieszka,
czy jesteśmy straszeni przez różne
because
ośrodki
we
dezinformacji?
are being scared by different disinformation centers that the war is about to start in Poland, that a nuclear bomb
Właśnie przy pomocy broni
will fall on our country, that Ukrainians are taking over
ukrainizacja.
our country.
Więc
So, a question to you,
mówię
should we be really afraid?
wojną. Może sobie to
And I'm talking about the military aspect first.
w stronie publicznej, że
So let's clarify it. Poland
i że Rosja
provokes war
się nas
with Russia. This is a very popular opinion these days. So is it true? Is there
Muszę rozstrzygać
something to be afraid of?
wszystkie scenariusze.
Well, of course, as an analyst, I should consider all possible scenarios. Each of these scenarios is plausible because Russia is an aggressive state.
Też
But Vladimir Putin
nie uważam go za psychopatę.
is not a crazy man, is not a psychopath.
Nie traktuję jak
And I don't think seriously about such developments as you have enumerated. Russia is military
że zdecydował się na
weakened,
wojnę w Ukrainie
crippled,
porobiony
and Putin invaded Ukraine because of his poor political position. He wanted this war to strengthen his power, but he failed. He is failing.
bardzo krótko odpowiadał.
So, shortly speaking,
Tutaj przeprowadzić bardzo długi wykład. Nie zdecyduje się
Putin will not
z państwami NATO ze względu
confront NATO because of his limited military potential
na północnoatlantycki.
compared to that of NATO's.
Będzie próbował
And second, he will
otoczyć
attempt to
jakby stworzyć taki parasol nuklearny
create a nuclear umbrella above newly occupied territories, about annexed Ukrainian territories.
nowe terytoria, ale tworzy taki straszak nuklearny
And this will be
nad
a factor to scare
w
the rest of the world,
stan teraz
because the condition of the Russian army in Ukraine now is perhaps the poorest ever in this war. So Ukrainians at this point have no other way out than to regain
a ten
their lost territory. And this nuclear threat doesn't work with Ukrainians. However, it works with Western European societies.
że zadziała w tym
Putin
kontekście, że Zachód
hopes
Ukrainę
this will work, at least to the extent that Western Europe will force Ukraine
że Zachód
to accept the new order. But seems like Putin has miscalculated his plan, because the West is learning Putin really fast. And Ukrainians help the West learn Putin and how to handle Russia. And Putin, of course, he is
się toczy o jego pozycję
in despair because he's fighting for his internal position
Ja uważam, że ma
and power. I think we shouldn't fear.
No właśnie,
We shouldn't fear.
a Putin walczy chyba nie tylko o pozycję we
Putin is fighting for his position, who knows, perhaps even for his life
pytanie,
at the moment.
znaczy tak
Yevhen,
polityczne czy lustrzane
a mirror question, because
wojną
we are being
Polakami.
scared with Russia. Ukrainians scare, Russian propaganda scares Ukrainians with Poles, with Polish lords coming back to Ukraine, and even that some referenda will be held to annex the Lviv region or Western Ukraine to Poland. Probably some voting ballots are already printed to make it possible.
Насправді це дуже цікаве питання, тому що
Well, interesting question and interesting topic.
в українські справи
This impact
і
of Poland on Ukrainian affairs,
буде претендувати на західну частину України,
and that Poland
озвучували протягом
aspires to grab, to seize West Ukraine.
Наришкін.
This is not
Прав Лавров.
so topical only for the couple of last months. For example, Minister Shoigu even mentioned that
Ну, Медведєва я не беру, тому
in
що
the mass media. Well, let's consider Putin in this hierarchy first, because, okay, there is Medvedev, but politically he's nobody.
і добре
In Russia,
скільки українців
they have calculated
порахували,
how many Ukrainians are in Poland as guests, how much money Poland is spending on keeping these Ukrainians here.
і, можливо, польським
And another thing
точно говорити.
that maybe the Polish people, the Polish colleagues don't want to speak about, not everyone in Europe, in European Union, like
Всередині Європи
the idea of future cooperation with Ukraine.
країн. З огляду на потенціал,
This is because our country is really big and has a big population, and we have a great potential. And
інакше
Ukraine is also capable of absorbing European funds. So these are the questions that
після завершення
the EU will have to talk about with Ukraine when Ukraine is ready to rebuild its country.
так само, як,
So we're not afraid of Poles.
чесно кажучи,
Ukraine,
тому
but Poland is not afraid of
Достатньо часто.
Ukraine.
слава
A
Україні.
couple of years ago, it was
Тоді
unusual to hear glory to Ukraine in Poland.
не проти Польщі.
And
проти Росії.
Although we tried to explain that Slava Ukraini isn't anti-Polish slogan, but it's anti-Russian. Now, I think on both sides of the border, everybody believes, everybody trusts that this is true.
Podsumowanie tej części naszej rozmowy, bo tak jak wspomnieliśmy, czas...
Well, an interesting wrap-up. The time goes by just like so fast as the Russian soldiers fleeing East Ukraine. So,
Czasu mamy,
if you have some questions, let's take some. We have a couple of minutes left.
może być
As many as 5 questions, as far as I can see.
następny
So this
ale kilka osób.
may be a problem, but, well, maybe those of you who raised your hands first,
Profesor
you may take the floor. Professor Pietrasik first.
Ja może tak stanę. Dzień dobry Państwu. Marek Pietrasiuk, MCS w Lublinie.
Marek Pietrasiuk, Curie University.
W kontekście Państwa dyskusji i tych wątków, które były
Referring to these multiple threads in your discussion,
informacja jest elementem
indeed, disinformation is part of state strategy, Russian strategy
politycznej,
to generate geopolitical change.
geopolitycznego,
And this geopolitical, geostrategic thinking is really
po drugie w kontekście uwag
at the very foundation of Russian policy. And speaking of Professor Legucka's opinion,
poznania,
indeed, Russia
identyfikowanie tego,
has studied, has explored Western weaknesses very well. If you speak about anti-systemic approaches, then today
w partię głównego nurtu, czy
being anti-systemic towards Western Europe is to target the leading political parties, the leading political forces that guarantee stability of the European Union. So, and this is part of Russian strategy. You say there is this targeting in messaging.
marketingowe
Well,
i te zachodnie
they have just, I think Russian have just borrowed certain marketing strategies from the West, now using them against the West.
Pani doktor,
And also, Professor,
czy Pani się zgodziłaby ze mną?
would you agree
Element.
with this statement that today
Uważam słabo rozpracowaną kulturę strategiczną Rosji.
we haven't fully analyzed the strategic culture of Russia? We haven't fully understood it.
Element
Would you say this was part of the strategic culture of the Russian Federation?
w tych uwagach
And Doctor,
zwrócił
you paid attention
to, że trudno jest poróżnić
that
dzisiaj Polaków
it's difficult to set Ukrainians against Poles and vice versa. But would you agree with me that
tej agresji Rosji
in
na
the context of Russia's aggression
danego
and its previous narrative on difficult historical
Polaków, Ukraińców i
background or
obserwowanie
animosities between Poland and Russia, do you think Russia is manipulating this idea of difficult past also between Poles and Ukrainians? And another thing,
w przeciwdziałaniu dezinformacyjnym działaniom Rosji
is Ukraine experienced enough to counteract Russia's propaganda? Can this be a model for Poland to follow? Maybe you can understand Russia better than us because you share the past, you share some Soviet legacy.
piętno i czy w tym kontekście
And in this context of
wszystkie
sharing this post-Soviet patterns and models,
iście wzorcami dla
would you also encourage the West to learn from it? It's a hypothetical question. I don't have a straightforward answer.
Dziękuję. Mamy naprawdę mało czasu, także po prostu zbiorę jeszcze powiedzmy 2 pytania i później...
So, let's have another
Tak?
questions from some more members of the audience.
Євген, якщо прослідити тенденції
A question to Yevhen.
використовувала Російська Федерація.
If we see disinformation used by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, well, if we look at it, this before the war, it was very direct, very clear, very open, or the kind of pro-Russian narratives in the social media, in mass media and on television. But after the outbreak of the war, given the unity and kind of unified stance of the Ukrainian society, and it became impossible for Russia to act so openly, then the narratives changed. So I would like to ask you, what tendencies in disinformation are the most dangerous ones? I mean, there are some risks that we may simply not recognize disinformation as disinformation if it's hidden or more nuanced. It was much easier when it was quite open before the war.
Dzień dobry, Łukasz Bielewski, pracuję w urzędzie.
Łukasz Gierewski. It's a very interesting discussion, but my impression is that there's very high level discussion as Russia versus the European Union or the world. I would like to get a level, just one level lower. About the role of regions, of local governments in countering the Russian disinformation within the EU. I'm also curious if you could give me some examples of this individualized or tailored manipulation addressed to the borderline regions in the countries neighboring Russia.
Zasadniczo powinniśmy już kończyć, to
we are running out of time in a while, so let me just give you the plan for today's action. After this panel we'll have a coffee break, and then 4 p.m. we'll have another panel discussion, the administrative and judiciary authorities in Ukraine. Now, if you could briefly answer these questions asked from the audience.
Ja może tak syntetycznie
Right, so just to be synthetic, and to answer the combined question from Professor and you.
Trochę odpowiem też na pani pytanie, bo to
And also touching on the lady's question here.
po wojnie mam wrażenie, że Rosja
After the war,
jest zwrotnym.
or just in this war, my impression is that it's a turning point for Russia.
Profesorem,
Then I would agree with you, Professor. Of course, it links to the Russian strategic culture. It's as a matter of fact, but now it's the turning point for Russia, and it actually tries to adapt to the current conditions, to the situation, and it has difficulty in doing so because it simply doesn't know what communication strategy it should adopt, and to a large extent this disinformation and propaganda, in my opinion, when I watch Russian TV, is rather, is becoming more and more aggressive, less nuanced, less subtle, less kind of subliminal.
niby społeczeństwo rosyjskie do działania.
Is rather mobilizing Russian society to act. But to answer your question, Professor, it's more kind of networked. It's less centralized compared to the Soviet times. But it has a trouble.
sposób komunikować się ze światem.
trouble about picking the right way to communicate with the external world. I mean, it's learning. That's my impression. How to influence the societies abroad, and in particular, how to act, how to influence, how to exert influence, on the regional level in the European Union. I have recently attended a training session,
Martyny Bildziukiewicz.
the StratCom, the European Commission organized by Martyna Bildziukiewicz, and
Władze lokalne
the way that the European Commission tried to involve local governments. Well, they invited the officials from local governments to teach them how to fight disinformation on the local level. And what the local media journalists struggled with is, lack of funding, basically, and no sources available of funding other than central government. So perhaps the local authorities could offer some options for the local media to get some funding or so that the independent media can operate better, in terms of buildings, premises, and here I'm communicating, their comments, but the European Commission also, listened to those voices and adapted training. Not perhaps to the local government officials, but to the local media journalists, which I believe is a good solution from the point of view of the EU. To be honest, I simply, can't give you any, specific example of Russian disinformation addressed to the local government or, borderline the regions.
Росія
I think that, of course, what Russia does actually, consolidates the Polish-Ukrainian societies, not only because Russia wants so, because it doesn't have any other option. Russian attacked Ukraine. For psychological reasons in the first place. It wanted to destroy one of the largest nations in Europe to show everyone else that they could destroy anyone. So that's why the Poles and Ukrainians getting closer and closer. And this is, the best times of our relations in our histories. Our task today is to maintain this plateau as a platform, to make it permanent. Because, just on a peak itself, can't build anything, lasting. So we need a plateau, and we need to maintain this as long as possible, not only through formal legislation, but also through getting to know each other, through various initiatives and so on. Now, Ukraine also struggles to understand, the mentality and sentiments in our neighbors. Poles know more about Ukraine than Ukrainians about Poland. The Ukrainians don't know nearly anything about Belarusians or Romanians, or less than they should know, to get them more actively involved in supporting them. So we need to be seeing our neighbors, in actual terms, and not through the glasses of Russian disinformation or propaganda. There are some difficult moments in our histories, between Ukraine and Poland, and we can't change that. What we can change is,
Другим номером
the plan for the future. I mean, moving history behind and, kind of designing our joint future, shaping the prospects for the coming 5 or 10 or 20 years. Cross-border cooperation in general,
дійні проєкти, які
I'm talking about, bilingual projects, to tell stories of ordinary people to our citizens.
які існують в знаннях,
Just to bridge the gaps that we have in our knowledge about each other. So this recipe for the way forward would be effective not only for the Polish-Ukrainian relations but also anyone else in this region. That Timothy Snyder calls the bloodland. The blood spilled actually is an obstacle to building the domain of democratic freedom. So we need a joint effort to kind of get rid of the blood legacy, to overcome the historical difficulties and build the common future. What's most important is what's most important or conspicuous in Russian propaganda is that Ukraine is not needed by the West. The Western arms are not effective in Ukraine. A single Russian soldier can destroy a whole unit of HIMARS in Ukraine and so on. These are the points that we need to counter. I would give you another example.
це, так би мовити, такий
Russian media claim that Russia will achieve their objectives whatever happens. So this is what we should focus on
Temat
the
bardzo
local level.
szeroki i można by jeszcze długo, ale
We could go on and on with this debate. I would like to thank the organizers, the interpreters, Agnieszka, Legucka, and Yevhen, Mahda were your guests and my guests on this debate. Thank you very much for your attention.